Okay, for those of you joining us on the recorded video, welcome to Week 15 Montana Government Studies Seminar. We don't have a video clip. There we go. All right, so announcements for this week. The Unit 4 reading guide, and I put this out on the Remind last Friday. As I was looking through the resources last week, which I should have done the previous week. And that's totally my bad. But I was looking and I clicked on the, there's a link in the course to a document that is from not your textbook, but a different textbook that's just a one-off chapter. And I clicked on the one that I had posted and it wouldn't load. I don't know why. I mean, it's a document that I had uploaded, so I don't know what the heck's going on with this thing. I tried to find the original document on my system. I couldn't. I don't know if I deleted it or what. But I went and looked at another teacher's course who teaches this in the summer, and they had changed over to a different chapter from a different textbook. So I did the same last Friday. So that is now in the course along with a textbook created notes page or several pages, sort of an outline kind of a deal for you. So if you had downloaded the reading guide before last Friday, as I'm hoping most of you had, and you'd been working on it diligently, as I'm hoping you all have, please re-download. And it's the middle part where instead of, I think the previous one was chapter 24. This one is chapter 23. The good news is it's a shorter reading, so there are fewer overall questions. There might be a couple more terms, but overall the length of the questions is much shorter. So it should be a bit easier for you. It's also a much better quality reading in terms of just the quality of the file. The previous one was like a scan of a photocopy of a chapter, whereas this is the actual, looks like from an actual PDF created from the actual textbook. And so it's a lot easier to read, more clear, and I think it's a little less challenging than the section from the previous book that we were using. So please make sure to, if you had downloaded it previously, download the new copy. You don't need to reinvent the wheel, just swap out those parts. And again, it's less to read, it's fewer questions, so this is a net positive for you. But just make sure you're working with the current document. You can't even get access to the old document anymore. I literally changed it in Google Drive. So there you go. You should be continuing your work on the Unit 4 reading guide. Remember, that is due next Friday. So get it done. It's not, I mean, it's especially with this new reading, it's not tons and tons of work, but there are a number of moving parts with it. There's the couple of videos that you need to watch and answer questions about. There's a couple of chapters that only have a couple of questions because you're only reading a couple of things out of those chapters. You're welcome to read the entire chapters if you want to. But you don't have to, obviously. So just make sure you're working ahead. Realize we're getting down to the end of the semester, and so when we get to the test over this unit, you're not going to have a full 5-day grace period on it. So it's the due date is the Friday before Memorial Day. The grace period I'm going to give you basically through Memorial Day. So it'll be due 8 a.m. So 8 in the morning. So the end of the grace period, 8 in the morning on June 1st, which is the day after Memorial Day. That's a Tuesday, and that's the beginning of finals week. I need that time so that I can get that in the grade book, so that I can have your grades
I have
done by that Friday. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question. So, are you gonna have a final, or is that gonna be the
Yes,
last test you take? Okay. Also a
yes.
final?
And
Okay.
yeah, and as I think I have down there, I'll have information on at least the procedures for the final next
Okay.
week. In terms of a review sheet, I'll have that up later, but I will have resources for that available, and I'll at least be able to tell you kind of what that's how that's going to look. If I guess almost none of you were with me first semester. What I had to do first semester, because I was giving district assessments, was I had everybody log into a Zoom session and leave their cameras on. And I had to sit here for, an hour and a half at a stretch and basically watch you take your final. I don't know. I need to check and see if I'm expected to give a district assessment for this class or if I get to give my own test. If I get to give my own test, I don't feel that I necessarily need to proctor it over Zoom. If it's a district assessment, that's how they're going to make me do it. So I should have something more definitive on that next week as to
All
how
right.
that's
Thank
going
you
to
so
function.
much.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, So remember, extra credit due May 24th. Some of you need every point you can lay your hands on at this moment. So make sure that you're working on that. I'm not giving any extra time because they take me actually a fairly decent amount of time to go through. So the 24th is really the last day that I can give you to turn that in. Don't forget to do the discussion this week or the seminar work this week. Again, some of you need every point, and that's been one way that lots of people have lost points, is not doing the seminar work, not doing the discussions, and that's just dragging down your grades. So make sure you're finishing strong. And last but not least, and as I say every week, please join the Remind, especially as we're nearing finals week. If something comes up, if something changes, like US history this week, I had to change the date of one of their seminar sessions. I sent that out on the Remind so that they would know what was going on. If you're not on the Remind, you're missing stuff like that when I have to make those changes. So, yeah. Any questions on that? I think we covered the final stuff. Anything else? Going once, going twice? All right. So we're talking state government today, and I realized by the time I had put this together and I was getting ready for Wednesday's session that I had already kind of covered this. We were kind of doing this throughout, as we, like on test weeks, we would kind of cover executive branch, legislative. So some of this is going to be reviewy. This sort of lines up with that new textbook chapter. This is not a replacement for reading that, but this gives you at least kind of some of the high points along with some further explanatory from me. But if this sounds familiar, it's because some of this stuff I did already cover when, we talked about the legislature and when we talked about the governor and when we talked about the state Supreme Court. Some of that ended up getting covered. So just be aware this is partially review, partially some new stuff. All right. So, really important concept as to why we're even talking about state government is this notion of federalism. And federalism is basically power sharing between between two levels of government. In our case, we're talking national government and state governments. And there are things that the national government has the power to do that only they can do. There are things that the state governments have the power to do that only they can do. And then there are things that both of them can do. and those are called shared powers. So I pulled, this is just an off-the-shelf graphic that you might find like in a textbook. But so in terms of national, maintaining military is a national government thing. Even the National Guard is largely paid for and equipped by the national government, even though the National Guard is technically a state militia as well as being part of the national military structure. Um, the funding and whatnot is all through the national government. Only the national government can declare war. Like Montana cannot declare war on Idaho or Alberta. That doesn't work. We're not allowed to do that. Establish a postal system. There is no Montana post office. That's a federal thing. Set standards for weights and measures. There is no Montana pound or Montana inch. I mean, that wouldn't work very well. You cross the border and suddenly inches are different. That's not okay. Protecting copyrights and patents, that would be something for individual states to do. Would make no sense. It needs to be a national thing. But states do things like establishing local governments. There's only one local government that is actually overseen by the federal government, and that is the District of Columbia. As a city, Washington, D.C. is the only city in America that is directly overseen by Congress, like their budget, everything. Although there is an effort now to make D.C. into a state, in which case that would no longer be the case. Set up schools, with the exception of schools on military bases, which we don't have any of those, oddly enough. At least not that I'm aware of. The students who are living on base come to Great Falls Public Schools. But there are some bases where, yeah, the Department of Defense has set up schools. But 99% of the time, it's states that establish schools, states and local governmental structures establish schools. Regulating commerce within a state is something that only a state government really gets involved in. Now, if it gets outside, if that business has, customers outside the state or something like that, then that's a different matter. Establishing and regulating corporations, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. And then things that they can both do. They can both collect taxes. Each year, if you work, you file a federal return, you file a state return. There are times where, I get money back from the feds. I owe the state $100. I don't know why. It's just how it works. Establishing court systems. There are two levels of court systems, as we'll talk about here in a minute. Regulate interstate commerce. So if it's between the states, that's federal. Again, if it's within a state, that's a state thing, I think, is how they're interpreting that. I don't know why they put that there, honestly. Regulate banks. So if a bank has branches in multiple states, then that's oftentimes a federal thing. If it's the Bank of Great Falls, then most of the regulation is going to be on the state level. State and federal governments can borrow money. The federal government can do it to a much greater degree than the states, but the states can borrow money in the form of bonds. Provide for the general welfare, punish criminals. There are federal laws, there are state laws. People go to jail in both systems. So there we go. So yeah, again, each part of government has things that only they can do and things that each can do. Another one, the federal government's the only one that can coin money. There are no Montana dollars. That doesn't work. State governments are the only ones that issue driver's licenses. There is no U.S. government driver's license. There is a Montana driver's license, there's a New York driver's license, etc. And then they can both collect taxes. Okay, so each state has a constitution. We talked about Montana's last week. One of the most basic things that a state constitution does is establish the basic structure of government. And this is almost without exception, in fact, without exception in America. Three branches: executive, legislative, judicial. There's no state that's like hanging out with only two branches of government. All 50 states have all three. Now, those three branches might look different state to state, but all 50 states have three branches, and they're all essentially the same three branches. Now, they may have a one house legislature versus a two house legislature. Their governor may serve a 2-year term versus a 4-year term. So it's not, 1-to-1. There are differences, but the basic three branches are the same. The state constitutions also set up structures for local governments. They can define what is a city, what is a town. In some places, they have things called hamlets, which are like little towns. Um, what goes into that? What's the population cutoff? I will tell you, a city in Montana is probably a town in a state like New York. Just Montana cities are practically just kind of big towns. Um, so all of those things are laid out in most state constitutions. Methods and limits on taxation. So if Montana were to adopt a sales tax, we would need to amend the state constitution to provide for that. Other states have a sales tax. We do not. The state constitutions establish agencies, boards, commissions, including regulating utilities, so boards to do that. Montana is a state that has a public service commission that we've talked about previously. Boards of education that oversee public schools. Most states, the legislature is not the be-all, end-all of managing schools. It's a board of public education that oversees basically all of the schools in a state. Yeah, so just for example. Now, a number of states are still on their first constitutions. That's certainly more common as you get into the West, where states are not that old. Surprisingly to me is that Massachusetts is still on its first constitution, like same constitution they've had since they became a state, which is pretty incredible. Montana, you'll notice, and as we said last week, second one. There, Georgia and Louisiana, 9. They change their constitutions frequently. I cannot even imagine that. But yeah, and that does not count the southern states that seceded and they had separate constitutions during those years. That doesn't count that. So yeah, Montana being on the second one, not that bad, especially because, as we mentioned last week, the first one was kind of a dog. So in order to change a state constitution, the process is generally the same in terms of the proposal needs to happen. Now, how that proposal happens differs from state to state. In some states, the state legislature is the one that has to do that. They have to pass a bill that says, okay, we propose that we change the state constitution to prohibit the use of cream in coffee. Okay, that is proposed. Both houses have voted for it. Yes, we need to get rid of that nasty cream. Okay. And then that has to be ratified. And in most states, that involves the voters of the state going to the polls, usually at the time of a general election where a bunch of other stuff is being voted on, and voting, yes, we want to get rid of the use of cream in coffee, or no, I like cream in coffee. So that's the general idea. Now, some states, like here in Montana, you or I or Crazy Freddy down the block can write a proposed constitutional amendment, and then there is a procedure to get that on the ballot. It involves going out and getting people to sign. and say, yes, I think that this should go on the ballot. You're not saying you necessarily agree with it, but you think people should be able to vote yes or no. If enough people sign that petition, and it's a kind of a formula based upon legislative districts. A certain number of people in each legislative district have to sign. The checking of that is a pain in the took us, by the way. So in Montana, that can happen. You, me, the guy down the street can write an initiative. Some states have set up special commissions or can impanel a full constitutional convention to do that work. But again, to ratify those changes to a state constitution, every voter gets to vote on that. Montana is one of only 18 states that have that initiative process where you, me, the guy down the street can write proposed amendments or actually even laws, just general laws. Montana is one of only a handful of states that have that. Tend to be more in the western part of the US than back east. To fully replace a constitution, most states require a convention model where basically delegates are impaneled and they can, kind of like in 1789 with the US Constitution, they can say, oh, we're going to make broad amendments, or we're scrapping this, like they did with the Articles of Confederation. Get rid of it, write something totally new. Constitution conventions can actually become free-for-alls where the entire system, everything that you've worked for up to that time, can be wiped away. 33 states have constitutions that are over 100 years old, which is kind of cool when you think about it. However, they probably have lengthy amendments. So branches of government, and again, this is stuff that we've talked about previously. So just to kind of recap, legislative branch, that is when they set up the U.S. Constitution. That was the branch that the framers, the founders, whatever you want to call them, set up first because they felt that that was the one that was most closely controlled, overseen by the people. That was the most democratic branch, according to the founders or the framers or whatever you want to call them, because they were the ones that most regularly were elected to their positions. In the case of like the U.S. House of Representatives, it's every 2 years. Same with the Montana House of Representatives. Every 2 years, your representative does something you don't like, get rid of them. Get somebody in there that will do your bidding, dang it. So in terms of state legislatures, 49 of the 50 states have 2 House legislatures. So only Nebraska has a 1 House legislature. So what does that functionally mean? That means that in Nebraska, it's a whole heck of a lot easier to pass legislation. Because in a 2-house system, a bicameral system, the House has to pass a bill, and then the Senate has to pass the exact same bill. Same down to the letter, down to the comma, everything. If they're different in any way, then the 2 houses have to get together, hammer out their differences, and then they both have to pass the exact same stinking bill. It can take a lot of time. Something can pass the Montana House and die in the Montana Senate. The Senate doesn't like it, or it'll pass the Senate and the House goes, no. So it's a lot harder to pass legislation in a bicameral 2-house system than if you just have 1 house that they pass it and then goes to the governor's office and the governor signs it or vetoes it. A lot stinking easier. All legislative seats across the country are determined by population. There was a time, as we talked about last week, where state senates especially were divvied up. There was like 1 senator per county, regardless of the population of those counties. In 1964, the Supreme Court ruled that was not okay, that we needed to conform to this idea of 1 person, 1 vote, and that every legislator in a given state should represent roughly the same number of people within, I I think it's like within 1% or something like that. So whether you're a legislator from, say, Bozeman or Billings, you represent the same number of people as if you're a legislator from Ekalaka or wherever, right? Same numbers. And that's in both the state house and the state senate. State senate in Montana basically is double a state house. 2 house districts make up a senate district, basically, is how they've divvied that up. Um, there are a few states that have what we call professional legislatures, where that's your only job. You're elected to the state legislature, and that's what you do for a living. You are paid, and typically paid relatively well, to go to the state capitol and decide things all year. New York's one, California's one. I can't think of the other ones. There aren't a lot of them. Most states have part-time legislatures that meet maybe once a year or once every few months, but most legislators also have other irons in the fire. You can't necessarily make a full living being a legislator. In Montana, we have what's called a citizen legislature, where literally everybody in it is something else, or they're retired. Lots of retired people in the Montana legislature, but that's, has its own income typically. But for the most part, legislators are, they're teachers, they're lawyers, they're whatever, doctors, and they take time off to go serve in the Montana legislature, which in the case of the Montana legislature, 90 days every other year. So there's no way you could make a decent living being a state legislator in Montana unless you, I don't know, live in a cardboard box or something. Um, that that just doesn't work. Second branch, the executive. This is primarily associated with the governor. All 50 states have governors of some way, shape, or form. The governor executes the laws. That's why it's called the executive branch. So the governor not only signs the laws, but it is up to the governor and the people under the governor to carry out those laws faithfully. In terms of structure, governors usually serve 4-year terms. There are 2 states that have 2-year terms, Vermont and New Hampshire. It's a 2-year term in office. There are 27 states that have a 2-term limit on gubernatorial terms. So governor can serve basically 8 years and they're out the door. Virginia actually has a 1-term, 1 consecutive term. So there is no re-election campaign for a governor in Virginia. The governor serves for 4 years, and then they basically have to take 4 years and do something else, and then they can run again, and sometimes they do. So they'll go governor, not governor, governor, not governor. That was a decision that was made to try and make the governor sort of more independent. That, they would do what was right, not necessarily what was politically expedient, because they weren't going to be worrying about re-election. Governors are the commanders in chief of state National Guards, even though the national government foots 99% of the bill for National Guard troops. And the national government can federalize a state National Guard basically anytime they see the need. Governors can veto legislation. Some states, in fact, most states, have what's called an item veto or a line item veto, where the governor can get rid of certain provisions in a piece of legislation but sign the overall bill. They tried to give that to the president back in the 90s, and the Supreme Court said, nope, that's not constitutional. Governors can call special sessions of legislatures. So if the governor thinks there's some issue that they need to have the legislature come back, and in a place like Montana, that does happen because our legislature only meets 90 days every other year. And then, in addition to the governor, there are other offices and departments that are a part of the executive branch of government. In Montana, that includes like the Secretary of State, which is an elected position, the Attorney General, which is an elected position, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, which is an elected position, but also things like the Department of Child and Family Services, uh, Department of Public Health, things like that are all technically under the auspices of the executive branch of government. They're not run by the legislature, although they are funded by them. They are not run by the judicial branch. They are run by the executive branch of government. So the executive branch can be huge and very powerful. And then finally, judicial branch interprets and applies the laws of a state. Most criminal cases, in fact, most cases in American courtrooms are seen in state courts. There's 50 state court systems. There's one federal system. Guess what? They're going to get the bulk of the cases in the state courts. That's just the law of large numbers. Um, so most states have sort of a three-tiered system. There's minor courts, think justices of the peace, um, city courts, traffic courts, things like that. General trial courts. So in Montana, think the state district courts, like the ones down in the courthouse downtown, the big now copper-colored domed courthouse downtown. The ones upstairs, justices of the peace, are downstairs, but the ones upstairs, those are all state district courts. So those are trial courts for more major offenses. And then an appeals, most states have some kind of appeals court. In Montana, we just have the one. It's the state Supreme Court. Some states have them tracked for, like Texas has a court that's just for death penalty cases. So some states have kind of a division of labor in that regard, but the general system is roughly the same. Um, most states elect judges for their state courts. Some are appointed by the governor, some are appointed by legislatures. In Montana, the governor has the power to appoint if a vacancy occurs in between elections. It used to be that those candidates would be nominated by a commission, and then they would forward three names to the governor, and the governor would choose one of the three names. Now, with the most recent legislature, they passed a law that basically bypasses that commission. That law is being challenged in court. So I guess we'll see what comes of that. One of the big things state governments do is regulate businesses. All businesses have to have a state charter to operate. This gives that business legal status. And depending on what state a business locates in, it really changes how they're allowed to operate. There's a reason why credit card companies and banks are often found, their headquarters are in Delaware. That state is very well set up in terms of corporate structure for laws and taxes to enable them to have a lot more freedom than they would in, say, New York. Insurance companies largely set up in Connecticut because the state laws are just very beneficial in that regard. Not saying there aren't banks in other states, not saying there aren't insurance companies in other states, but you will see a lot of those businesses located in those states. So states can regulate insurance rates. So if you're an insurance company and you want to offer coverage for sale in the state of Montana, the state auditor or the commissioner of insurance and exchange can regulate what you charge or how much you're allowed to increase your charges year to year to help protect consumers. Or they can kind of dictate, okay, you're going to cover these things, or you don't have to cover these things. The state administers licensing for professions varying from doctors and nurses to accountants, real estate agents, teachers, cosmetologists, all have to be licensed by the state, and most have to pass tests administered by the state in some way, shape, or form so that the state can verify, yes, they're qualified to practice, or no, they're not. Um, Regulate public utilities, things like electricity, gas, water, even internet now is considered in many places to be a public utility. And those companies have to get approval from state regulators before they can raise rates or offer other services. Consumer protections, including things like landlord tenant laws, basically outlining what it's okay for landlords to do and what rights tenants have. Those are state things, those are not federal things. States can regulate credit card interest, which again is why so many credit card companies are based in Delaware. Um, Safety standards for workplaces is largely a state concern. There is a federal uh, organization that oversees that as well, but largely it's the state that oversees workplace safety. Um, States can also try and attract new businesses via tax incentive, and even like sending the governor to talk to a corporate board or a CEO or something like that to try and convince a business to locate in their state. Just came out a week or two ago that Wisconsin had been trying to get a facility from the electronics manufacturer Foxconn to come in, and they had given all sorts of tax incentives. I mean, basically, Foxconn was going to be paying no taxes whatsoever, practically none, to locate a facility in Wisconsin. And they signed the agreement and they were building buildings and it fell through. And so, yeah, they had basically allowed Foxconn to build a bunch of stuff with, no taxes being paid. And now they're stuck with all these buildings that, what the heck else are they going to do with them? Um, so yeah, that kind of thing does happen. But even to attract businesses like Walmart and stuff like that, states and local governments can say, okay, we'll waive, you know, property taxes, we'll waive these taxes so that it's cheaper for you to do business. Education, states are the primary governments that are responsible for establishing and maintaining schools and accreditation of schools and licensing of teachers and things like and funding for schools. There are some states that have no local school districts at all, that the entire system is run on the state level. And the legislature basically functions like a big school board. But like a state like Montana, we have local school districts that sort of oversee, but the state is the largest funding vehicle for public schools. Now, does the federal government also step in and fund schools? Absolutely, but not nearly to the extent that state and local taxpayers do. Um, all states license teachers. Some states have agreements between states to recognize each other's licenses. Oh, good, my connection's unstable, just what we need. To recognize other states' licenses, like if I wanted to go teach in West Virginia or something, I could probably get license reciprocity, and my Montana teaching license would transfer at least to a temporary license in West Virginia. But I would probably have to take a course to teach history. I would probably have to take a course in West Virginia history. Teeth optional. I don't know. Just kidding. Regulating and providing for health and welfare. States license doctors, nurses, chiropractors, cosmetologists, etc. All of those things are licensed by the state. You cannot operate and do those jobs without a state license, period. End of statement. States can regulate the sale of drugs. There are certain pharmaceuticals you can't get in the state of Montana that you can get in other states. States can decide, oh, we're going to allow marijuana as medicine. Other states go, that's baloney. We're not you don't get to get high and call it medicine. That's not